Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Foundations.
Because there's a lot of people, a lot of Christians, they don't understand why the Jewish people are so, let me say, suspicious of Christians, and they're also sometimes feel quite hostile and angry towards Christians.
Foundations. Understanding the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. With Robbo Robinson and Mandy Warby.
Replacement theology is very prolific within Christendom and has been for almost 2 millennia, but many Christians today have no idea what it is, how it came to be, or how devastating it's been on the Jewish people. Last time we arrived at the starting point of Jewish persecution in Germany, but we're going to look very briefly at a pattern that is evident toward Jews throughout their history to lay the groundwork for one of the darkest periods of Jewish existence.
You know, Robbo, when Ian and I have taken people on tours to Israel and the subject always comes up of replacement theology, I'm usually looked at, Ian describes it as a cow looking at a new gate. They kind of go, What? I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of replacement theology. And then you start to unpack it and explain it, and they kind of go, I didn't know anything about it, or they've got, isn't that just what the Bible says? There's not a lot of understanding about it, and that's why we kind of went back to the official, what we would call probably the first official leader of the early church, which was Constantine, and how it really got embedded there in an official way. And as you said, we've come up to that point, at this just before the Second World War with Hitler.
Yeah, that's right. So that's kind of where we left off at the last episode, at the start of Hitler's influence in Germany after their humiliating defeat in World War I. So, of course, we're coming out of World War I. It's that period between World War I and II. And I guess taking a look at the history of the Jewish people to reveal a pattern that is evident toward them, no matter where they've been throughout the world.
When leaders of nations and empires and cities held the Jewish people in contempt, which was sadly most of the time, the Jewish people were forbidden from owning land, having public office, developing careers in the professional fields like doctors and lawyers, teachers and the like. They were not allowed to be public servants, certainly not politicians in positions of power over anybody else. Now, they could be farmers and work hands most of the time, not owning the land, just working for somebody else. They were literally allowed to just eke out a living, just hiring themselves out as cheap labour. But when leaders of nations, empires and cities were more lenient, less hateful towards the Jews, more accommodating, their Jewish constituents were permitted more freedoms and opportunities, and they prospered and they thrived and they contributed a lot to their communities. And it's like this pattern of oppression and restriction and then permission and acceptance has been described as a zigzag.
Yeah, those ebbs and flows.
Yeah, they'd
be
up and they'd be down.
Yeah. And obviously when the Jews were allowed to prosper under fair and reasonable rulers, they would have that opportunity really to flourish. But then, of course, that crushing comes, and the sad thing is that I guess the crushing periods were a lot longer and more intense than those brief moments of reprieve. They
absolutely were, and they were treated appallingly. And again, this common occurrence of the down periods when they were not allowed to own property or have regular possessions, and, Christian leaders would generally permit the Jewish community really only one profession, and that was to be moneylenders. That's really the only thing they were ever allowed to be.
Wow. Well, of course, the Bible talks about people that lend money. There's fairly specific rules around that in the Old Testament, which talks about not charging interest or usury. So I guess that probably was beneficial for Christians, but not so much for Jews.
Yeah. Well, see, the Jewish people, God said, don't charge interest and usury to your own people, your own brethren. Well, as far as the Christians were concerned, the Jews were certainly not their brethren. So that was the only thing they were allowed to do, because Christians weren't allowed to be money lenders, couldn't charge each other interest. So the Jews could be money lenders. But here's the thing, they then condemned them for charging interest. But charging interest was the only way they could actually make a living.
Exactly.
If all they did was loan $100 and get $100 back, they're not going to make any money that way. There's no profit in that. So the only thing they were allowed to do, they were condemned for doing.
Yeah,
it's like they were damned if they did, damned if they didn't. There was nothing that the Jews could do. But I'll tell you what it also did. It emphasised the historical trope that the Jews are just greedy, money-grubbing misers. That's all they're after. No, they're good at their professions. They're good at any of the professions that they do.
Yeah, that's right.
They really are. But if that's the only profession that they were permitted to do, well, I mean, how are you supposed to survive if that's all you're allowed, but then you get condemned for it?
That's right. And I guess it stands to reason if they are in that profession and they are able to charge some interest, then they're clearly going to make some money, and that actually may lead to the fact that they're better off. Which is only for their own benefit. And
it also adds to the conspiracy theorists who then go on to say, see, the Jews control all the banking throughout the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And it goes back to this particular time in history of oppression of the Jewish people. It's like they created a monster and then blamed the monster, even though the Jews were not the monster.
No, that's right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Now, about 2001, I got a hold of a really good book. It's very hard to get a hold of. It's rare as hen's teeth. But if you can get it, it's worth it. It's called Hated Without a Cause by Graham Keith. Really hard to find. I thought I'd lost my copy, but I didn't, and I'm protecting it with my whole life. But it goes into a great deal of detail explaining about the history of the Jewish people and this particular cycle and, what they were forbidden from doing, what they were permitted from doing. It's really well worth a read.
Okay, so that book is called Hated Without a Cause by Graham Keith, worth checking out. Now, let's remember we're picking up at this point of Hitler's influence. So we're around before the start of World War II. But, of course, the life of Martin Luther plays a part in all this as well, doesn't it?
Tragically, it does. Look, most Christians know about Martin Luther, okay, and he did amazing things. He was like the final impetus for what we call the Protestant Reformation, his famous 95 Theses that he nailed to the doors of Wittenberg Castle. He did a lot of great things, no doubt about it. I will never take away from that. What he thought, right, he really thought that when he broke away from the Catholic Church, that the Jewish people would flock to him and accept the gospel, because he thought that the only reason they were not interested in the gospel was because of the Catholic Church and its treatment of them. But they didn't. Remember, they were under judicial blindness, okay, from God. He's the only one who can lift that. And he has been, and he is doing that, and he has always throughout history in small measure. But because they didn't flock to him and accept the gospel, he became quite embittered against them. And as he got older, he became virulently anti-Semitic. Now, a lot of Christians don't like this. They want to hear about the good things that he did and the good things of church history. And I get that. This is my tribe too. But you have to take the good with the bad. And this is part of the bad. And what it led to was horrific. And so he wrote a book towards the end of his life called The Jews and Their Lies. And it is so bad. I bought it. I've read it. It's horrible. And I am going to share some sections and segments from that particular booklet in the next episode of Foundations. And again, it's not going to be easy, but it is very, very important, because there's a lot of people, a lot of Christians, they don't understand why the Jewish people are so, let me say, suspicious of Christians, and they're also sometimes feel quite hostile and angry towards Christians. And we kind of go, why? I love the Jewish people. I don't understand. Why don't they like us? It's because we don't know history like they know history.
Well, I guess it is important to have this understanding of history. And as mentioned, we're going to be looking at some quotes from that booklet, The Jews and Their Lies, in the next episode of Foundations. So we'll pick it up at that point and continue in this period of history as we continue to understand this whole area of replacement theology on Foundations.
This has been Foundations, a look at the Jewish foundations of our Christian faith. For study notes, resources and more, see vision.org.au/foundations.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.